And before this video begins, I would just like to tell you that I have a PO box until early December. So if you want to send me any like fan mail or like jokey things for me to open in Patreon videos, or if I get enough in an actual video on the main channel, just send it to this address, and yeah, just thought I'd let you know. Anyway, on with the video. So, it's finally over. After 5 long years, the Chibnall era has finished with the climactic special The Power of the Doctor, which does star Daleks, along with Cybermen, the Master, a Death Star, and an industrial-sized kitchen sink. It's probably the busiest and most fan-servicey Doctor Who episode ever made, because there's just so much going on in it. Companion returns, multiple villains, Degeneration X, Unit. Chibnall really decided to cram it full of literally everything he could think of before he packed his bags and left the show. So, is it good? I have a reputation for being very harsh on the Chibnall era, which is weird considering I made like a 2-hour video essay all about why Flux wasn't actually that bad. So you're probably coming into this episode thinking I'm gonna rip it to shreds as usual, but I think my views on the episode are very different to usual, which isn't surprising because there's just so much going on in it that it's hard to wrap your head around it all. So I hope you have your popcorn handy because it's time to dive into The Power of the Daleks. God damn it, I mean Power of the Doctor. I guess the easiest place to start is with the beginning, which is a literal 42 reference, out of all the stories to have a callback to. Well, at least it's not a reference to the sex gas of Torchwood. We're reintroduced to the so-called Cybermasters as they rob a train for a child, who ends up being a weird energy source thing. I don't know either, it's very confusing and barely explained. The Doctor even just hand waves it away at the end by saying, "Lol, the universe is a bit weird, innit?" I guess some Chibnallisms never change. I do think the Cybermen are interesting during this opening because they're shown as a legitimate recognised force within the wider universe, which is good. We got a glimpse of that during Flux, but it's a lot more prominent in this episode as the Cybermasters easily overwhelm the train thanks to their regeneration abilities. I still think that aspect is a bit ridiculous, since the Timeless Children made them converted Time Lords. At least Chibnall stayed committed to the concept and killed it off in this episode, rather than acting like it had never happened at all. But this whole heist cold open looks terrible. The CGI of the train is really patchy and looks low quality, while the music is way too loud so you can barely hear anything. It's a constant issue with this episode. Half the time you can't even tell what anyone is trying to say. I can't quite put my finger on why, but this train heist cold open comes across as really flat and anticlimactic. It just kind of happens, without much consequence to the wider episode. The only real importance of the opening is its effect on Dan Lewis, the wisecracking Scouse companion from Flux. There's clearly been more adventures interspersed between the subsequent specials, but things come to a head here at the end as Dan gets shot by a Cyberman and Yaz only just saves him from being flung off into space. I really appreciate how this actually has an effect on him, because he realises how lucky he was to survive, starting to question his travels with the Doctor because of all the danger he's constantly in. In a way, it kind of mirrors Tegan's own exit.
If you stop enjoying it, give it up.
Tegan.
It's stopped being fun, Doctor.
Dan no longer sees the fun in travelling in the TARDIS because it's so dangerous and he'd rather stay on Earth where it's a little bit safer. It's a great idea for a companion departure because much like Martha, he chooses his own terms and doesn't stay too long and pay the price for it. But however, much like Graham and Ryan, it's so flat and underplayed, almost coming too suddenly. I know there's narrative potential of a sudden departure reminding the Doctor that everyone has different perspectives to our own, but they don't play upon that. And because this all happens right at the beginning of the episode, it feels so weak. He is a fully fledged companion who has been travelling for 9 episodes at this point, so his departure should have had some kind of dramatic weight to it. But instead it feels soulless and empty, almost like they're just kind of shoving him out of the story because it doesn't have room for him. They could have done so much better than Dan just deciding to peace out to go hang out with Bradley Walsh. So, why did the Cyber Masters want a random child from a train in the middle of space? Well, apparently it can power their planet, which has been entirely cyber converted somehow. Yeah, they barely explain it, as per usual. I should love the idea of the Cybermen literally converting a full physical planet into a piece of technology for them to use, but it's so badly handled. They barely explore the concept, and instead we only get to see a quarry in typical Doctor Who fashion. It looks like there are vast factories and cyber cities, which would have been a fantastic visual and something we've never really seen in the show before. But instead of exploring that idea, we instead get the Master cloning Ashad the Lone Cyberman and putting a bunch of warrior Cybermen into a toy of him before shrinking it to transport them into UNIT. It's really unnecessary and feels like a convoluted way to rip off the Genesis arc aspect of Doomsday. I mean, hell, they literally could have just stormed the base anyway, they can regenerate. What are UNIT gonna do about it? The episode barely even explains how the tissue compressor can now randomly be undone. The Master just sits there and goes, oh yeah, that can happen now, lol. Much like in Flux, there's no real reason for UNIT to be involved other than leading to a bunch of character returns, since Kate Stewart brings back Ace and Tegan. Because yeah, they're UNIT operatives now, I guess. People will probably disagree with me, but Kate isn't really much of a character in this episode. She's just a plot device, and all she does is serve as a bit of a nuisance for the Cybermen attacking UNIT. She does significantly more in episodes like Power of 3, and she's never even really in much danger, even when she risks her own life for conversion, because yeah, you know they're not going to go ahead with that. I also find it weird that they act like Kate is only now getting to go into the TARDIS for the first time, when she did that back in The Vanquishers anyway. So yeah, that's just a weird aspect. I didn't know what was going on there.
How is it bigger on the inside?
But yes, let's address the quadrillion returns in Power of the Doctor. It has a lot. Like Vinda randomly showing up by crashing on the cyber conversion planet and then helping Yaz to defeat the Master. And then he leaves because Chibnall doesn't know how to write characters out. Hey, at least there wasn't anything about his as yet unborn child being the Doctor. Something a lot of fans theorised because goddamn some Doctor Who fans are just ridiculous. But I liked Vinda's inclusion here because he didn't need a big role. And I just love Jacob Anderson so much, so it was nice to see him again. It was also nice to see the return of Tegan, even though really she doesn't do much. I appreciate how she still hasn't fully forgiven the Doctor, since they left on pretty bad terms. There's a touching scene as a hologram of the Fifth Doctor talks to her and they make amends, helping Tegan to forgive him. It's a nice scene to repair their fractured relationship, although other than that, she just climbs down a ladder and unplugs a computer, magically beating the Cybermen by zapping them or something. Oh, and Chibnall also retcons Russell T Davies' establishment of Tegan and Nyssa being a couple, which is a disgrace, and Chibnall should have been fired for it, to be honest. Clearly homophobia. The other big advertised return is 7th Doctor companion Ace, who still carries around a bat and wears her jacket from the 80s because I guess the last 33 years never happened. Who needs good character writing when you have exposition and those tasty, delicious member berries? She investigates missing paintings which ends up going nowhere, and she also almost dies parachuting off a building, only for Yaz to magically materialise the TARDIS to save her. Yeah, I'm not buying that no matter how many post-it notes you have. Ace is also used really weirdly in the episode, but I like that she gets her own reconciliation scene with her Doctor to sort out the awkward history between the two. Although, speaking of, Chibnall bizarrely retcons the book At Childhood's End, which literally came out during his era, featuring his Doctor and companions meeting Ace. I guess he just wanted to add to the dumpster fire of Ace's timeline, because apparently she hasn't seen the Doctor for 30 years and doesn't even know Graham, who, yeah, she randomly comes across in a volcano because he's off on his freelance adventures like he said he'd do when he left the TARDIS. It's random, but they have good chemistry and it's fun when they take down the Daleks together, so it gets a pass. Speaking of the Daleks, they exist in this episode, for some reason. They're the most pointless part about the entirety of Power of the Doctor, which is annoying because if they weren't in it, I probably wouldn't keep calling it Power of the Daleks by accident. In this story, they're skulking around underneath volcanoes to somehow explode them all at once and destroy the world or something. It's like a terrible B-Tech reality bomb. all the volcano stuff could have easily been the Cybermen instead, because if you take the Daleks out of the episode, you wouldn't even notice. Although there is a brief plot thread about a rogue Dalek trying to help the Doctor, to which she literally says, "That's new." Is it, Doctor? Is it really? Have you forgotten Rusty, or Dalek Khan, or Dalek Sec, or the Lone Dalek, or a billion other Daleks in expanded media? Yeah, it's definitely new. We've never had a disillusioned Dalek help the Doctor before. Anyway, it dies, and then the others throw the Doctor into a shell as a prisoner, and then they basically stop existing. They don't even acknowledge the fact that she wiped out an entire Dalek fleet at the end of the Flux event, which I guess never happened at all because no episode after it has acknowledged that entire series. And even either of the Daleks isn't addressed at all. There's no sense of there being a Flux aftermath because the universe is back to normal. The only single piece of evidence it ever even happened to begin with is Dan's house being gone. I'm not kidding. The Division isn't mentioned at all, the Fugitive Doctor only has a hologram cameo, so you could almost skip the entirety of Flux, Eve of the Daleks and Legend of the Sea Devils without impacting power of the Doctor in the slightest. That's not a good look, is it? The Daleks and Cybermen are simply working for the Master, because yay, we really needed a lot more Cybermen being tied directly to the Master. And yes, he makes his return after his apparent death at the end of Series 12, although as we know, nobody's ever really gone. I have no idea what the Master's plan is meant to be in this episode. For some reason he's masquerading as Rasputin, which is a little bit weird because that was always kind of meant to be the meddling monks thing. But old Grigory was rumoured to be a bit hypnotic and psychic, so I guess it works for the Master too, because you know, he uses his Master Hypnosis. The Master turns his TARDIS into a big power source for his cyber-converted planet, and parks it in 1916 before goofily sabotaging paintings and getting himself captured in the modern day. Then the Cybermen rescue him, then he goes back to Rasputin mode, then he gets the Daleks to capture the Doctor and bring her to him so he could force her to regenerate into him, and then he can do evil things to get her cancelled by space Twitter. It makes no sense why the Master's plan is so complicated and has so many moving parts required to make it work. All he needed to do was lock her in a cupboard and cosplay as her. All this forced regeneration stuff is completely pointless and just ruins the interesting idea of the Master pretending to be the Doctor, something that has been done better and more effectively in expanded media. It's like, why does he need to get himself arrested by UNIT and then bring in the Cybermen if all he really needs is to just take the Doctor's jacket and then go, "Oh, I'm the Doctor." He doesn't even dress in her costume, he makes his own. He could literally do this without any of that stuff. It makes no sense. I mean, I guess there's the whole ego thing of him being able to say like, "Haha, you became me." But really, we didn't need the whole forced regeneration thing. It just added way too much complexity to an already crammed episode. The scenes of the evil Doctor would be a lot more effective if it was still Jodie, showing how the Master's mind is in her body. It would lend a lot more credence to the storyline and allow Jodie Whittaker to explore her acting range by showing her talents in a more villainous role similar to the Cyber Planner back in the Smith era. It would also make Yaz more reluctant to abandon the evil Doctor because she'd still be hoping her literal romantic crush is still inside there somewhere. Either way, it's fun to see the Master in a costume combining parts of every Doctor, but Sacha definitely overdoes the crazy wackiness during the story, trying to chew the scenery like it's an all-you-can-eat buffet. However, rather bizarrely, this wraps all the way back around to being so bad and goofy it's fun and entertaining. Like, the scene of him dancing to Rasputin by Boney M is absolutely terrible and cringeworthy. It's perfect, and I never knew how much I needed it in my life. It's so fun. But ultimately, the Doctor's friends help her return to her body and the Master seemingly dies on a collapsing planet. But you know he'll be back because, well, it's the Master. By far the best part of the episode comes as the 13th Doctor is trapped within the body of the evil Doctor. Despite all the leaks and advertised returns, the best kept secret is the return of David Bradley, Peter Davison, Colin Baker, Sylvester McCoy and Paul McGann all appearing as versions of their incarnations, with the AI hologram aspect even allowing the 5th and 7th Doctors to appear in costume and interact directly with their definitive companions. It's an absolutely brilliant brilliant way to bring all these actors back despite their advanced age and provide a sweet tribute to classic Who Doctors. And yes, we got Paul McGann, baby! To celebrate, I'm gonna drink champagne from my mug gan and give myself lead poisoning. McGann Gang. This kind of representation is exactly what I've always criticised Day of the Doctor for not having. That episode only featured modern doctors in a setting tied directly to the modern show. Outside of that Tom Baker cameo, there was almost no representation for the doctors and the companions of the classic show, which, by the way, lasted for 26 years and kind of made everything else possible. Who cares if the actors are a bit old now? It's a time travel show. There are easy ways to work around it. Chibnall places them all in a dreamscape and a hologram AI thing so that ages don't actually matter because you already know who they're meant to be. Meaningful cameos like these are exactly what you want from a celebration of the show, and the way the scene is done makes me wish they'd done it in The Timeless Children instead of just The Fugitive Doctor. But I'm glad Chibnall wasn't scared to focus on the classic Doctors, because having Smith or Capaldi would have overshadowed the others. This time we actually got classic Doctors and classic companions, meaning the episode encompasses all 59 years of Doctor Who and not just the modern era. Similarly, it's cool how there's a companion support group at the end set up by Graham and featuring Mel, Joe Grant and Ian Chessington's World of Adventures. I've always loved the idea of a support group for families of companions, but this is close enough and allows these characters to actually open up to others about all the crazy things they've seen. It's a sorely underexplored aspect of the show. When the companions leave, they return to a world that wouldn't understand them or accept their stories and experiences, so they would become incredibly lonely and isolated. It was a core component of Torchwood, exploring how characters like Susie and Gwen struggle with bottling everything up because there's no way for them to open up to their loved ones. It's even my own headcanon as to why Martha broke up with Tom Milligan and married Mickey instead, because they could actually understand their experiences and they didn't have to hide their past with the Doctor and the TARDIS. They could find common ground that they wouldn't be able to find with any normal person, which is why I find it so easy to believe that they ended up together. I just love the idea of companions dealing with the isolating nature of knowing there's so much more out there, and it's sweet to see past companions all in the same room together. In these meetings they can finally be themselves and talk about all these wonderful and terrifying things they've seen. Dan can find a healthy avenue to express his fear about almost dying on the train, and Yaz can process the emotional pain of falling in love with a time and space traveller who could never be with her. It's a wonderful thing to add to the show, reminding you of the positive and negative impact the Doctor has had on all these friends and allies. I also like to think of the empty chair as a tribute to Sarah Jane Smith, who did research on other former companions with the aim to see who else was out there and possibly meet them. It's almost like this support group is continuing her legacy, especially because on a meta level she was the first classic companion to appear in the modern show, and within the universe she helped to lay the groundwork of bringing companions together to continue the Doctor's legacy, which is why almost all of them appeared at her funeral. Even in death, Sarah Jane brings companions together. A big concern I had going into this episode was whether it would be a case of too many cooks, and it was, and wasn't at the same time. The plot is atrocious and non-existent with too much going on, and the first half jumps around so much with so many Chibnall title cards, along with the episode just throwing too much at you too quickly. But once everything is finally set up, it goes really quick and is filled with incredible moments and twists. It's almost like when a terrible football team is carried by players performing acts of individual brilliance. There are too many villains and supporting characters, to the extent that there's even a scene ripping off Journey's End. I mean, come on, remove the Daleks and face the facts that the supporting characters are only good because they already exist, and things will feel a little bit more balanced. But somehow all this chaos and overuse of familiar things finds a way to work because of the character interactions and the returns in general. It's completely unashamed fan service, feeling more like something from Children in Need, but that makes it fun and stops it feeling like a slog to sit through, so the pacing actually feels decent for once. It leaves me torn, because the story is criminally bad, but it's made bearable by having good moving parts propping it up. It's dumb fun, and I think that's giving it a better reputation than it probably deserves. Barely anything made sense, There was an unbearable amount of pointless exposition and narrating things you can already see with your own eyes, along with the conclusion being terribly rushed as always. The Doctor just fiddling with the Master's TARDIS to convert lava into steel or something? It's very weird and doesn't really feel like a victory, especially because the lack of an exit for all the lava would eventually build pressure and probably cause more damage when the volcanoes do need to erupt naturally. We'd get like 1,350 Krakatoas. Yeah, you did it, Doctor. You sure saved the world. But all these flaws are covered up by the familiar characters being pushed in your face, you know, jingling the keys so you don't think about anything that's wrong with the episode. Some of the comedy did get a genuine laugh out of me, especially some of Dan and Graham's lines, but it really does feel like all these characters and crazy moments just plaster over the gaping cracks. Power of the Doctor flatters to deceive, because it's like someone's fanfiction, where they throw in a bunch of existing characters and monsters, like Ace shows up, then Tegan shows up, oh and Unit is there too, and the Daleks and Cybermen work together, oh yeah, and then the Master becomes the Doctor. There's so much insanity and nostalgia in the episode that you can't help but enjoy it as a fun and exciting romp if you're already a Doctor Who fan. However, if you're a first time viewer or part of the very casual audience, you'll probably be completely lost because of how much it throws at you all at once. It's especially eyebrow raising when you remember Chibnall began his era as a complete break from the past. He refused to use existing monsters or characters in an attempt to softly reset the show's baggage and cultivate a new audience, only to then make his era one of the most convoluted and lore-based periods of the show, culminating in the single most fanservice-y episode in its entire history. I just find that progression so wild and interesting. Power of the Doctor is a downright mess full of nonsensical madness, but it's super fun to watch and has so many familiar faces. So surely that has to count for something, right? And now we're at the part that pretty much matters the most out of any of these episodes, the regeneration. How does it stack up to the previous changeovers in the show's very long history? Well, the 13th Doctor dies because of an extreme lactose intolerance reaction to an ice cream. No, not actually, that was a funny joke. Instead, she just gets laser beamed to death in a really sudden moment. It's kind of a ridiculous way to go out, but there's been worse, come on. Like, it could have been the 6th Doctor bumping his head on the TARDIS console. It is good that 13's impending regeneration wasn't the big focus of Power of the Doctor. The previous 3 regenerations had been dominated by the plot point of the Doctor knowing their death was coming, but this was more like Parting of the Ways, where it's a grand scale climactic narrative that simply ends with the Doctor paying with their life. It's a nice change of pace, even if the initial death feels a little bit too sudden and undramatic when it does happen. There's one last stab at Thasmin, because Yaz carries the Doctor into the TARDIS and they share that fateful ice cream together as one last adventure, but then the Doctor just kicks Yaz out and tells her to do one because she wants to regenerate alone. They don't even kiss or share a suitably romantic moment, they just still feel like friends. So that whole Thasmin storyline comes to absolutely nothing. So much for all that focus in the last 2 episodes then, the cowardly BBC couldn't even have one of them say, "Hey, I like you a bit more than a friend," let alone "I love you." I hated all the Thasmin stuff because of the annoying Twitter stans, but even I felt cheated out of a payoff. Well, I guess this means off to AO3 I go. The story then ends with a very interesting regeneration sequence for a number of reasons. Let's start with the final lines. Tag your rep. It's a horribly abysmal last line compared to some of the excellent ones in years gone by. Hell, One Last Sunset would have been absolutely perfect and amazingly poetic, but the moment in general at least serves as an optimistic look at the change, rather than treating regeneration as some kind of depressing ending. It's very in character for the 13th Doctor to want more time, but still embrace the future in a joyous and sweet way. So even though the final line is a bit weak, the Incarnation's attitude towards her regeneration is nice. Although she does just kind of mumble a speech to herself, which felt really weak and non-committal. I mean, it doesn't have to be all grand and theatrical, but at least say it clearly enough for us to understand it. Then 13 stands on a cliff and Power of the Doctor's into David Tennant in a really cool continuous shot, which looks fantastic and is a stylish way to evolve the regeneration format. But then it's overshadowed by Doctor Who desperately trying to claw back lapsed fans and casual audiences by using an actor who left 12 years ago. Of course, I have to reserve judgment until next year's specials resolve and explain it all, but for now, I have very little faith in the decision to bring back David Tennant. It just reeks of a desperation to regain relevance by going down the cheapest possible route, especially with the return of Donna and her family too, basically acting like it's still 2008 and the golden years never ended. The BBC is essentially admitting that they don't have any faith in Doctor Who's success unless it has Russell T Davies and David Tennant as the faces, and I think that might do more harm to the show than any of Chibnall's storylines ever did. But the single worst part of it all is the downright cowardly decision to not have Tennant in 13's outfit. They definitely did that at the last minute just because of my tweet. Shame on you, BBC, shame on you. The Power of the Doctor is an absolutely insane episode, for better or for worse. It's so hard to talk about and break down because of how much is going on there. It feels like an entire series of ideas smashed into one special. I wouldn't go so far as to say Chibnall redeemed his era with this episode, but he definitely left fans with a much better taste in their mouths and ended the Chibnall era in a way that leaves you somewhat happy, rather than a simple relief that the pain is finally over. It shows that Chibnall is capable of pulling out fun and explosive episodes that entertain fans, so it baffles me that he failed so spectacularly for so many years before this episode. Power of the Doctor actually made me feel things, and it had interesting parts. It's dumb fun, but it's still fun. Therefore, I'll give it a D ranking on the specials tier list, and here's why. Because I know that sounds harsh. It's not enjoyable as a story. It's enjoyable as individual moments of brilliance. It won't age well because a lot of people's opinions on the entire episode are coloured by their nostalgic reactions. There are very few standout shots. I mean, they're great when they're good, but then you get awful looking sequences like the train opening, and the unit HQ is lit really weirdly, along with truly criminally bad sound mixing at times. You can't hear what people are saying, and when you can, they're just spouting too much exposition because yes, the episode still suffers from all the Chibnall issues, like exposition, wonky pacing, rushed endings, and an overly complicated plot. If you asked anyone what it's actually about, they probably wouldn't be able to give a coherent answer, because the Daleks were pointless, the Master's forced regeneration plan was needlessly complex, and Dan was just pushed out of the door like an afterthought. In fact, as usual, the supporting cast was also bloated, but that's disguised because they were all previously introduced, so Chibnall doesn't actually have to put in the legwork to introduce them or write them properly because they coast by on nostalgia points alone. Power of the Doctor is a case of fans pretty much having no expectations. The marketing was almost non-existent, to the extent that fans knew and cared more about the next era than this episode, so it felt like it was purely ceremonial, something to get over and done with in order for the next era to finally be ushered in. I would easily give Power of the Doctor Best Moments YouTube compilation an A or a B ranking, but the episode as a whole is just propped up by fan service and all the main Chibnall problems are still there. So it's safe to say that the Chibnall era died as it lived, confusing, badly paced, and reliant on moments of individual brilliance. So yeah, it's over. And I'd like to give an extra special thank you to my as Bantium level patron Fallon Cortez, my Platinum level patron Maximilian Foreman, and all my Gold level patrons Calvin, Daniel Shillito, Franzorn aka Line Vortex, Gog Nogler, Herna Verzog, and Luke_SY. Thank you so much for your support.